What was it like meeting Roger Waters? Because he joined you on stage at one point. Yeah, and do you think he's generally very supportive of what Nick Mason is doing?
Well, I can't. I mean, he- he's a tricky guy.
No.
But I think it was nice for Nick to have his blessing.
Anyway, let's do this interview because we're talking about your wonderful album, This Destination, which actually came out at the end of January. There is a purchasing link just below this video. I urge you to check it out. I really enjoyed this album
Thank you.
through East West Records. I suppose the first question I've got for you is quite a heavy one, and that is, what's more important, the destination or the journey?
Well, I sort of reached a destination making the record actually, which was to feel a lot happier, which is kind of what you do when you finish a record. You always feel rather elated, and being elated isn't really a great place to write new music. So I think what happens is you then start doing lots of promotion like this, and you're already saying goodbye to the music. Um, and I do think that most songs and probably some of the best songs I write are when I've got issues. So arriving without any issues, clearing all those issues up isn't really great for songwriting. So it is the journey, isn't it? It's the
Yeah.
journey is the better place. But I don't wish upon myself problems, but that's where I think a lot of the best music comes from is questions in the head of the writer
Yeah.
about his or her life.
I suppose without any issues, we would never have had Joni Mitchell's Blue. We would never have had Bob Dylan's Blood on the Tracks. All quite painful albums, weren't they, really? All,
Yeah, yeah. So you see what I'm saying. I mean, obviously
yeah.
that came out of a period when people were starting to write about themselves for the first time. I don't think that was a subject that was ever broached in the 60s, isn't it? Do you not think? Do you think that it's the early 70s when that sort of autobiographical writing came? It was
Yeah.
very similar to sort of the romantics and the poet of Byron and Shelley, and in the early 19th century when they started writing
Yeah.
poems finally about themselves.
I often wonder if that singer-songwriting thing came about in the very early 70s due to the disappointment or disillusionment, the death of the hippie dream or the hippie ideal, perhaps. It was all those Laurel Canyon writers,
Yeah, no, I mean,
young people like,
100%. I mean, the difference between Graham Nash's 60s writing and then what he wrote in the 70s was very clear. But I do think, yeah, of course, post Altamont, I think things people and people change their opinion on.
yeah, well,
It's just they had
Almond is,
something. They've been trying to fight, hadn't they, against the government for quite a long time. And
mm,
I suppose it was different for Neil Young. He was much more of a writer about other people's problems and
yeah,
a political and issue led. But where other writers were more sort of navel gazing, really.
yeah, yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that. I don't think I like it.
No, of course not.
No. Um, in the promo, it states that this destination is your most personal album to date. Why do you feel that?
Well, actually, there's a bit of promo in that, but because I also thought In Solo was pretty personal as well, and I think the two are very much conjoined, really. Um, I think I came back to writing solo work very late after Little Bruises. I think I got a bit knocked sideways after Little Bruises. Little Bruises in '95 wasn't really fitting into the scheme of things, and Brit pop especially. And obviously it was a chart failure, and that meant something to me then. But I was very proud of the work anyway. So I came rather late into, and that was a very personal album too. It was about a breakup of my marriage, and was the greatest inspiration for that record,
Mhm.
and dealing with failure. And I think that just generally, that's the difference between writing now and writing when I wrote for Spandau. I've experienced failure, and I think you know but I think coming within solo a few years ago and now this album, they're definitely albums about being a certain age. And at this age, as let's look at the opening track, Borrowed Town. It's about no longer being the chief of the city, right?
Mhm.
It's no longer being on top of the wave of the city. I don't go out my door and get hassled like I used to. And, I'm not calling the shots like I used to. I borrowed London for a while. Now, I could go two ways. I could be an old codger that you see on the internet moaning about how it's not proper London anymore. It's not what it used to be, or accept the fact that it's never what it used to be. It's always in change. It's always in flux. And
Is Borrowed Time about the fact that
Borrowed Town, Borrowed Town.
Borrowed Town, sorry, is it very much about the fact that eventually we're not here forever and then things move on? Or is it generally a sense of growing old, really, and
I
sort of,
think it's about where do you find your place when you still want to live in this in a major city. And
yeah.
there was a time when you were the force that was changing the reality of that city. You were making it. You were forging it. And you no longer do. When I was in that place in the 80s, the old fellas had fought in a war. I never took any notice of them. They must have looked at us and thought, "What the fucking hell are we doing?" But so I think it's about accepting that you just borrow the city, and then you borrow the town. And where do you find your place then? So the chorus of that song is "Give me your village," and "Give me your village." That's my family. That's the place that I find love, And but I still love being here. I still very much. I mean, so much of the album is about the city. Windswept Street is about Soho.
Yeah.
It's comparing the Soho that I once lived in, and I once, you know, met people who changed my life,
So
and
we find our place ultimately within ourselves.
within ourselves and within the people who love us. I think.
You talk about Soho, actually. I used to go up to London quite a lot because I'm from Reading originally. Travel up to London quite a lot. There used to be a shop in Soho called Shades. I don't know if you know it. This was the
Oh,
80s,
yeah, yeah, it rings a bell. Yeah.
but I think that went years ago. But they used to sell vinyl bootlegs in the back room. That was just fabulous. So 'cause I was into sort of metal in those days, and I used to
Oh,
get all
right.
this dodgy stuff in the back room. It's a fantastic little shop.
Yeah. So that would have been like who would have been it? Def Leppard and
Oh God, in the
Iron
80s
Maiden,
I was
Iron
Motorhead,
Maiden.
Iron Maiden, Kiss, all the
Def Leppard's a bit too pop for you, probably then at that point.
no, I like I think it was the first couple of albums. I think they got very poppy, but these days metal is something I might listen to at the gym, but it's not something I'd put on
But
in.
it's funny how I could have grabbed one particular strand of music and let it drag me along. And then I chose this side. So my brother and I went to every single AC/DC show when they did that residency in the Marquee.
Mhm.
And I would have been 15, just 16, and my brother was 14. And but we went to I think it was on every Sunday night for a month. And Angus Young would have been 18 or something like that. And we loved it. It was amazing. And then we went to Eddie and the Hot Rods, and then we found punk. And obviously punk joined me back up with Bowie.
Yeah.
But I could easily have gone that way because AC, it was an incredible show they were doing. And just sort of one, if I'd bumped into someone who'd said, "Do you want to form a band?" at that point, it would have ended up sounding like AC/DC.
Right. Well, I mean, I always liked music that was more brash, more abrasive, more guitar orientated. Spandau Ballet was, I mean, they were huge in the 80s, but they were always very too smooth for my
Well,
taste.
yeah, but the early stuff wasn't, the
No,
first
that's
two
right.
albums, to cut
Yeah.
long story short, and all of that electronic stuff, and then it was me really, exploring myself as a songwriter. So, when we were a club band and we were making stuff like To Cut Long Story Short or Chant Number One, Paint Me Down, that was really about the club scene that I was involved in the late 70s, early 80s, the Blitz and the Beetroot, and making songs for them really, and for our scene. I mean, the Chant Number One is all about the Beetroot. And then I wanted to be a songwriter like Al Green or Marvin Gaye, and I wanted to do that. And it was like, because I like soul music growing up in the 70s as well, and I love funk.
Not, are they, is it those soul influences that prompted that change of direction with the True album?
Exactly. So that was me thinking, I'd really like to go this way, and try this out. So I think I pushed the band into certain directions because of my desire to write in certain styles, you know.
Mhm.
And then of course you find a voice and it's successful, that voice, and you sort of go with it. You know, I was equally as inspired, and I think some of that comes out on this album and my solo stuff. The three guitarists that inspired me would have been Gilmour, Mick Ronson, Nile Rodgers. So I think in the 80s I focused more on the Nile.
Right. Mhm.
You know, as I get older, I can you know experiment with all three.
You like all that sort of Gilmore-esque, spacey sort of playing.
I like melody
Yeah.
in work, and I've always thought Ronson had a fantastic ear for melody, but also yearning. He had a great way of making the guitar cry. Most of that is done with his right hand,
Mhm.
funnily enough, with the pick with the plectrum hand. You know, and having seen Ronson when I was a kid a couple of times and loving Slaughter on 10th Avenue and the melodies in that. And I think a lot of that spills into the work I do now.
Mhm. Mhm. I mean, I was quite interested. I'm more interested in the sort of guitar stuff. I mean, back in the 80s, as a kid, I loved Adam and the Ants. They just hit the music scene like a burst of color, I think, until 1980. Did you have any run-ins with Adam and the Ants at all, or at the Top of the Pops or anything?
No, not really. Although Adam is someone I met in LA when I lived there in the 90s a few times. But no, I think they certainly did. You know, when people look back on the 80s, it really is. I'd sort of point to them as being the first band in color, if you like, you know.
Yeah.
But you know, and they came out of the same, you know, out of punk. And we came out of punk. You know, we were inspired to get together because of punk rock and because of,
Mhm.
you know, seeing those bands and wanting to be like them. But the band I think that really made me want to be in a group more than ever was Generation X. I thought Billy Idol was fantastic, and we followed them around a lot. But because I love the melodies and I love the pop attitude, and I always thought he was a star.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you mentioned Bowie. How influential was Bowie on your musical direction? And do you think the New Romantics were kind of clinging to Bowie's coattails, really?
Oh well, we were certainly Bowie kids, you know. That's, you know, in the same way that Bowie was a Little Richard fan, you know, and you can
Yeah.
see that in his work, you know, or he was a fan of Johnny Ray or Scott Walker. There, you know, we've all got our, you know, idols that we mold ourselves upon.
Mhm.
And so for me, yes, it was Bowie. It was also Roxy Music, and I think that was hugely. I think, you know, Brian Ferry was as equally um, as influential upon the new romantic scene as Bowie was. But a little story about, you know, rejecting Bowie was when Bowie was, you know, Mick Jagger had already tried to get in the Blitz Club. The Blitz Club was only a Tuesday night, by the way. It was just Steve Strange taking it over on the poorest night of the week and letting his mates in and having a very different sound in there. And then everyone was kind of buzzed about it because it looked so exciting. But the music was really different. You know, that was down to Rusty Egan, you know, playing German music a lot, what we call krautrock, I suppose, and Bowie stuff. And but Mick Jagger had already been rejected trying to get in one night, but then Bowie came, and of course they let him in, and a lot of people went running off to sit with David. And I remember there was a bunch of us, including most of my band, saying, "Don't go over there. He's yesterday's man," and refusing to sit with him. Um, so I think we were inspired by him, but I wouldn't say hanging on to his coattails because I think, you know, we in the end the roles reversed, and I think what he was trying to do with Let's Dance was to try and catch up with a lot of other young kids who'd already created that sound.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you touched upon punk. I think in your autobiography you mentioned seeing the Pistols, but to cut a long story short, was that written while you were the Gentry? And you state again your book, you describe the Gentry as an anti-punk statement.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
What
Well,
did
I
you
think
mean by that?
virtually all of the first album was written as the Gentry because that's what we were called when we very first showed ourselves to our friends. And then
Yeah.
Bob Elms said, "I've got a better name than that." Um, no, definitely we knew that we were too young for punk, and that and I was kind of post punk. Just sounds awful, doesn't it? It sounds like, you know, you're neither one nor the other.
Yeah.
And I quite liked rejecting the idea of rejecting the music press, because I just thought the music press didn't understand working class kids. They didn't understand the most popular, the most exciting youth cult in the 70s that was purely working class and was connected to everything mod was the soul boy. And the soul boy spending all his money on clothes or her money on clothes, going down to, wherever it might be, the Lyceum, Lacy Lady, Crackers, and dancing and being the star of the evening, being the focus of attention. That was not mentioned at all in any of the music press. It was as though it didn't exist. Reggae was mentioned, but soul and funk just got sidelined.
Yeah, yeah,
And I felt that what we were falling. We were soul boys by heart, it just seemed to me to reject the music press was the way to go. And of course, then, rather timely and because of the zeitgeist, along comes smash hits and the face,
yeah,
and
yeah,
just made for us.
yeah. I mean, interesting in the late 70s. I mean, I'm a huge fan of progressive rock. But by the late 70s, we were 3-day weeks and power strikes, the winter of discontent and youth unemployment. Maybe 30-year-old millionaires in capes just weren't appealing to the youth at the time.
Well, of course, it's all part of my DNA anyway. Because I'd gone to all of that. I met my old mate the other day, who's a soul boy. He came on a radio show I was presenting, and I just thought in my head he was an utter. That was all he did. He was a soul boy, and he only went. But I got him on. He said, "No, don't you remember? We went to see Barclay James Harvest. We went to see Genesis with Peter Gabriel. I saw ELP. I mean, it was." I went through that stage of loving, that Close to the Edge was one of my favorite albums for so long.
Right.
Uh, would I admit that to any of my, mates who bought great looking clothes, who like Brian Ferry? No, but as a musician, I was soaking all of that up as well. I was a working class kid who went to a grammar school, and in the grammar school, I met middle class kids, and middle class kids had a different set of values about music. They wanted things that were more classical and more Bachian. They'd grown up with classical music in their house. I grew up with Billy Cotton. You know that they progressive music suited their tastes. It gave them an in into what was fundamentally a working class art form, which is pop music. And I was aspirational as a working class kid, and I just fell into that. And that's what I want to do. I love that music. I mean, the first music track I ever jammed in a band to was Set the Controls to the Heart of the Sun.
Oh, excellent. How prophetic was that?
Yeah.
Interesting, Rick Wakeman
Sorry,
said,
Barry, as you could tell, I can waffle on.
no, that's fine, that's fine. Interestingly, Rick Wakeman says in the very early 80s, if you went into a store and asked for a prog album, they'd hand it to you in a brown paper bag and just slip it to you. Going back to the new album, Take the Wheel, it's this lovely film noir video to it, by the way. You sing in that song, Is There Anybody Out There Who Can Take the Wheel? You seem to express a sense of helplessness. What inspired that number?
It was the first complete song that I wrote for the album. I wasn't in a very good place, to be honest. 2 years ago, I had experienced a great sense of mortality. I was not feeling good. I had a lot of anxiety. I have a beautiful home. I have a beautiful family. Everything is right, but for some reason, I'm not feeling good, and
Mhm. Yeah.
um, and I was in a bit of a struggle. To deal with it and how to deal with it. And of course, one of the places I deal with it is in my um, sort of music making room, which is I don't write songs with a keyboard with a computer in front of me. I write songs with either with a piano or guitar, acoustic guitar, and um, and I just went to that piano, and it was just film noir seemed like the right setting. It seemed a bit dark and shadowy. The situation I was in, it seemed like I needed to find who my nemesis was inside me, and I was having a bit of struggle. So that was the song that came out, and it came out pretty complete as you hear it.
Mhm.
Um, by the time I get to record it, I've moved on a bit, but that was definitely my if it felt like I was trapped in those shadows at that time. Um, yeah,
After a dark night of the soul, was it?
it was just, yeah, I just, a bit- I was, I started to see therapy, do therapy, but music is my therapy. And as I finish songs and songs like that, which I've already made my head feel better, so
Good.
bit by bit, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's important that the 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 press stuff says it's the most personal album. There's no point writing something that hasn't got anything to do with anybody else, because if it's so personal, then I'm the only one who's interested in it. It's got to be universal. So you've got to be offering someone up something they recognize and go, yeah, that's me. Oh wow, I'm in that situation. I get that, or I've been there before.
Yeah.
Uh, because that's all we do in art, is we try and help people out, and subconsciously that's why we have it as a tool.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so. How important was Trevor Horn to the Spandau story? Well, you've already answered that question. Are you a Yes fan by any chance? But interestingly, not only but how important was Trevor Horn to the Spandau story? What did he have against your drummer?
Oh, right. Well, yeah, I remember when we first got together, and he was going to produce the True album. And at that time, it was called the Pleasure Project. And because Pleasure was one of the songs that I'd written for it, and he really liked that song. And we were working on it in rehearsals. And he decided just to go in and record that song because he thought it was potentially a single, and begin the record there. And we spent a few days, 2 days, in Air Studios in Oxford Street. And yeah, John's a fantastic drummer. John's always, never been a problem. You can hear it on all the records. Uh, he's been, he's very much part of the band. And but Trevor was drilling him hard for 2 days, and I just think Trevor really, as great as he is, he likes to have a lot more control, and especially at that time with the rhythm section, and putting things through Fairlights and stuff. And he tried to get us to lose John, and we refused, and we said no, yeah, and it was a kind of deal breaker, really, and we moved on. But we'd gone back to Trevor on Instinction, and he reinvented the band on that, because I don't, as much as we loved Richard, I don't think he quite got how to make Instinction commercial for the charts at that time. And the charts were definitely changing. Trevor had created ABC, and it was a sense of, productions were improving everywhere in the 80s. And we'd had this song, and we'd had a bit of a failure with She Loved Like Diamond. It didn't reach the top 40, and we were in a bit of a panic mode. And this is on our second album, we had to do something fast. And was Instinction a single? Yeah, it could possibly be a single, but maybe not the way it was. And so we called Trevor, and that was the beginning of our relationship with him. And he said he'd love to have a go at re-recording some of it and remixing it, which he
Yeah.
did, and it put us back in the top 10.
Yeah. Yeah. You say Trevor Horn was he liked to be in control. I get the impression it's a bit like Bob Ezrin is a little bit the same, really. Everyone who's worked with Bob Ezrin said he's quite a taskmaster, really.
Yeah, but these are great, imaginative people. Are they good with bands? I'm not sure. You
Are they
know,
great artists or are they great producers?
well, they're both, but a great, uh, it depends who you're producing. If you're producing a solo artist, Trevor is perfect. I think, it- but I think if you want to retain all the musicians that you have in the room still playing on the record, you might want to go to an engineer-based producer like a Hugh Padgham or someone like that. Or I think Swain and Jolly were a really good mix for us, because Steve Jolly looked after the vocals and Tony's performance, and Tony, who grew up as an engineer and began as an engineer, was fantastic working with us at creating the backing tracks.
Yeah. And what do you think of someone like Phil Spector as a producer?
But I think, well, it's interesting because you
And
know,
brilliant. I mean, I love those the Phil Spector Christmas album, the stuff he did in
yeah.
I love all that stuff, but the more I read about him, he comes across as quite a frightful character,
Oh
really.
my God, oh, without a doubt. But he will only ever make a Phil Spector. He would have only made a Phil Spector record. I mean, look at the way Let It Be was possibly destroyed by Phil Spector.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
look at the way
You prefer the naked version, do you?
probably,
Yeah.
but I'm not used to it anyway. But I yes, but probably, but and I am. But there's a story, isn't there, where when George did Wah Wah. And they were all in there. I think Eric was in there, and they're all making the song. And when they came out for the playback, and Phil played it back, and it was like swamped in reverb. And I think George was very shocked at that point and didn't think it was the way to go, but was eventually sort of talked round or brought himself round to it. Because yeah, I mean, it depends what you want. If you want a Phil Spector Wall of Sound, you would have gone to him, wouldn't you?
Well, I suppose without Phil Spector, would we have got Pet Sounds? Because Brian Wilson was so influenced or so enamored with
Oh,
Phil Spector's work. So,
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's one thing leads to another. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Let's turn our attention to Pink Floyd, all things Pink Floyd.
Mhm.
Um, were you always a fan of early? Well, you've already said that you used to jam out to Set the Controls for the Heart of the
Well,
Sun. So
that was by chance, really,
Mhm.
because it was there was a there was a counterculturalist family who lived in Islington called the Landersmans. Jay Landersman's quite a famous little sort of counterculturalist, and his wife, who was a poet, and Cosmo Landersman, writes for the Times, is their son. But I knew Miles Landersman, who was one of their sons, and I met him through my drama club. And I went round to Miles's house. It was the first time I'd ever seen a wok, ever seen a bottle of wine half open, ever seen posters of Chairman Mao and smelt of garlic, and the chairs didn't match the sofa, and it was like, wow, this is a strange house. And we went downstairs to his basement, and there was me and Phil Daniels, who and these other kids that I knew from drama, and Peter Hugo Daly, and Miles had Pink Floyd, and he played Set the Controls to the Heart of the Sun, and we all started copying it and working it out, and then jammed it all day. But I didn't I didn't get into Floyd at all until Dark Side of the Moon. Um, and then bought Relics, so I sort of went backwards. But the first time I ever heard any early Floyd would have been, well, from apart from that, Set the Controls, was when Bowie did See Emily Play on Pinups. So that was my introduction to that Syd Barrett stuff.
Yeah.
And but it was really about, I was a classic kid who bought Dark Side of the Moon.
Well, I did an interview with John Lydon, interestingly enough, and he said the Piper at the Gates of Dawn were probably the closest to rock and roll Pink Floyd got to. Um, it's certainly a strange out there album. But do you see Syd Barrett as he's kind of portrayed as a seer of visions, or do you see him merely as a psychedelic doodler?
I mean, I thought he helped to create the psychedelic kind of songs of whimsy. You know, I mean, obviously the Moody Blues album that was, Songs of Future Past was very much, you know, pushing things in that direction. There was a scene happening down at the UFO club. Um, but that idea of writing sort of very British songs, singing in a very British accent, London South accent. I mean, obviously the beat bands had sung in I suppose it was a thing, wasn't it? I mean, Ray Davies spoke in an English, sung in an English accent before, but it was more that sort of whimsy of nursery rhyme and silly stories and and funny little, this idea of someone stealing women's underwear and that kind of rather fairy tale land, really, that Sid created was accompanied by Sid also looking beautiful, handsome, cool. His hair was not like any the thing we'd seen before. those sunken cheekbones, and those kind of faraway eyes, and so he was definitely a role model for Bowie, who came along immediately after that, and setting up at Middle Earth Club down the road a year later, and then the look of Ziggy Stardust is so close to the look of Syd Barrett. The look of Johnny Rotten is so close to Ziggy Stardust to Syd Barrett. Syd kind of changed so much and influenced so many people. We mentioned about Bowie and Ferry being a great influence of the 80s. Syd was a great influencer of the 70s, and
Yeah.
even though he wasn't around. And one of Floyd's greatest albums was all about him, of course.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, it's a good idea to sort of focus on that with Syd Barrett because when we talk about Syd Barrett, it tends to be considered a very tragic story in many respects, I think. And Shine on You, Crazy Diamond feels like an elegy to somebody lost, really. So,
Yeah, but it was also, don't forget, I mean, Roger was feeding off of, in a way, off of the corpse of Sid. He wasn't dead, but he knew Sid still had to be in the room. So if I'm going to write a masterpiece here, I've got to write about people being mad. I've got to write about wishing you were here, and shine on you, crazy diamond. I mean, everything from Dark Side of the Moon to Wish You Were Here was still about Sid. He was trying to evoke Sid to put him back in the room because he knew how important he was, because he was the greatest frontman, and yet he blew his mind out. But
yeah,
and even David's guitar style, the sort of the lots of delays that he used with his effects pedals, that was handed to him because Sid had started that work,
yeah.
and that's how Sid was played. So I do. He never went away, and
Well,
he
Sid kind of burns out and then he re-emerges as the brilliant and dazzling metaphor of the crazy diamond in 1975. And he's the wide staring eyes on the wall. He certainly, Wish You Were Here is a haunting and haunted album in many respects.
Yeah. And then I think about him, when I'm on stage with Nick, and we all
Yeah.
think about him because we do so many of his tracks, and I sing quite a few of his songs, and but I think I channel him through a different, because I can't relate directly to Sid, but I can relate to Bowie. And I think there was a sense that, so much of Bowie, got so much from Sid to create his own character and his own voice. As I said, See Emily play on pinups was the first time I ever heard it. And so the mixed guitar riff, the down, 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 is what I do on stage with Nick. I
Yeah.
throw a bit of that in.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Does Nick
it's.
Mason often talk about Sid with you at all or reminisce about Sid
Oh, I
Barrett?
think we have over the years, but we don't ask the questions anymore. I think we've been there, Yeah, I mean, just, you know, nothing that nobody already doesn't know, it's stuff that's already in his book, and the sadness of it all, and just, how, you know, they had to make a decision fast, didn't they?
Yeah, Nick Mason in his autobiography expresses the fact that he said he seems to feel very guilty about that decision not to pick him up that day, and they went on to play a gig in Southampton or something, and that was it really.
Yeah, but
History was written.
do you honestly think that they would have been the band of the size that they were if
Mm.
Sid was it's still in it? And the answer's probably no.
No, of course not. Well, it's interesting. You get this after the Sid years, you get this experimental what Gilmore calls psychedelic noodling until they kind of found where they were going with sort of metal, then eventually Dark Side of the Moon.
Yeah, with Echoes, I think is the beginning of that sort of
Mm.
Imperial Floyd.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's support. That's something Gilmore states as well. That Echoes is the
Yeah.
start of it all, really.
So it makes it a pleasure for me to play. We really enjoy doing that, and I think that's coming out on Record Store Day. That a recording of us doing it at the last show we did in Frankfurt last year.
Okay.
Uh, that's coming out, and it's been mixed by Stephen Wilson.
How did you get to work with Stephen Wilson? I mean, he just strikes me as a very busy chap. That's all.
We just became very good friends actually, and we saw each other socially, and I really admired his work, and we met actually at a Gilmore show. I think it was the tour before last, whenever that was, 8 years ago. And Phil Manzanera introduced me to him, and I thought fantastic ideas. And I went up to his studio, and I just, just connected. And he loves 80s music as well as all. He just loves music. He's like me, and he's just done um, Atmos mixes of Spandau stuff, and that's coming out soon. And he really enjoyed doing that. He loves, he's done Tears for Fears, and he's done, various XTC, and then I and then I wanted him to work on this album, and I played it to him, and he was really excited, and he did a fantastic job. And listening to it back in Atmos in his studio was just amazing. The idea you can just pick out that guitar from here and that guitar from here, there. They're all like hanging fruit. It's just a beautiful way to listen to the music.
Yeah, yeah. What was it like meeting Roger Waters? Because he joined you on stage at one point. Yeah, and do you think he's generally very supportive of what Nick Mason is doing?
Well, I can't. I mean, he's a tricky guy. But I think it was nice for Nick to have his blessing, and for him to stay for the whole show and to come on stage and do. Ironically, set of controls. That's where I began as a kid. It all those years later, I think we were more buzzed that Bruce Willis was there.
Wow,
We'd,
wow.
we'd spent the whole of the tour having a running joke about Bruce Willis
Yeah.
because Guy said to me, there's no such thing as a Willis hatch in an elevator. That doesn't exist. There's never a hatch in the roof of an elevator. And so every time we went to a hotel, we'd look up and go, no Willis hatch, obviously. And we're playing at the Beacon in New York, and Bruce turns up, and he's sitting in our dressing room, which is up on the sort of fourth floor, and you have to get the elevator down to the stage. And of course, like a lot of stars, they don't go out before they go out with you because they want to go out in the dark. So Bruce traveled down the lift with us, and we all got in the lift with Bruce. And the first thing Guy and I did was look up, and there was a Willis hatch. It's like he obviously only gets in elevators that have got that escape route for him.
There you go. There you go. Funny, I always watch Die Hard at Christmas. I keep insisting with telling my daughter it's a Christmas film, but she doesn't see it like that. It's Christmas should be all reindeers and all that sort of stuff. But it's
Yeah, I mean,
definitely
apparently you can get an advent calendar, can't you? And as you open it, it's different days.
Hans Gruber is dropping down there or something.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
One last question for you, actually, and it's a question I ask everybody because I'm always interested in people's responses to this one. Frank Zappa said, "Jazz isn't dead; it just smells funny." Um, with now the rock and roll shows now are all very much pre-programmed, singing to backing tapes and backing tracks. How healthy then is rock and roll?
Um, I don't see. I'm maybe too old, and so I'm going to complain about it, and I don't want to be one of those old guys who complain. Um,
I mentioned
I
it.
think I think it's in a different place. It's in a completely different place. It's it it's done remotely. It's not necessary that the social connection doesn't have to be in a smelly room
Mhm.
to be creative. It's done from home. Um, it's expensive to be in a band.
Yeah,
It certainly, but then it always was. It was never going to make you a millionaire unless you were really, really lucky. How healthy is it? Well, rock and roll. See, actually, the question is pointed
mhm.
because you're not saying how healthy is popular music. You're saying
Yeah.
how healthy is a particular genre of music, which is rock and
Okay.
roll. And I
Okay.
think that's certainly not an important genre anymore.
Yeah.
My kids they love rap. They love what's going on in the streets of London in rap. They love what's going on in the streets of New York in rap and LA. and they are tuned into new artists that I've never heard of, that don't sell a lot, that haven't got big streaming numbers, that are sort of underground. So I think that genre is bursting and is happening, and so that's in a healthy place. So I think it's more about people's tastes changing. We don't
Evolving.
we don't do rock and roll so much now.
Yeah, yeah. Great answer. Anyway, I'll just plug your album again. Gary Kemp, This Destination actually came out at the end of January. It's a thoroughly enjoyable album, and there is a purchasing link just below this video. I urge you to check this album out. Gary, thank you so much for your time today.
Barry, it's a pleasure being on the show. I've seen a few of your other YouTubes, and I think you do a great service. And I'm really was really glad to hear you wanted me on.
Anyway, thank you so much. You have a fabulous day.
All right, mate, and you. Thank you. Bye bye.
All the best, mate. Cheers.